In 2019, Italian archivist Marco Venturelli opened a sealed metal safe in the basement of one of Europe's oldest libraries. The safe had not been opened for 340 years. Inside were maps that showed the world in a way that is completely different from how we know it today. On these maps, dated to the 1680s, a massive continent was located between Asia and America, a continent with cities, trade routes, and ports, a continent that does not exist. Or did it? 2 months after the discovery, access to the archive was closed. The official reason was restoration. Venturelli resigned and refuses to give interviews. What is depicted on these maps? Why were they hidden? And most importantly, what else might be hiding in sealed archives around the world? Let's start with what we know for certain. In the archives of several European libraries, the Vatican, the National Library of France, and the Leiden University Library, there are 17th century maps with restricted access. This is a fact that can be verified through their catalogs. Some of these maps are only partially digitized, while others are not available to the public at all. Why? Official explanations vary: the fragility of the materials, the need for special storage conditions, or incomplete cataloging. All of this sounds reasonable, but there is one curious detail. Among the maps with the strictest access restrictions, there is a disproportionately high number of nautical charts of the Pacific Ocean from the period of 1650 to 1720. Let's look at a specific example. In 1998, cartography historian James Cook Jr., not to be confused with the famous explorer, published an article about a curious discrepancy. He compared Dutch nautical charts from the 1680s from various sources. Some maps were kept in the Amsterdam Maritime Museum, some in private collections, and several copies were found in the archives of the East India Company. On the maps from the museum and private collections, the Pacific Ocean between Asia and America is depicted roughly as we know it today: the islands of Polynesia, open spaces of water, and familiar outlines. But on the maps from the East India Company archives, those intended for internal use rather than for sale or public display, there was a landmass in the central part of the Pacific Ocean, a large one, roughly the size of Australia. Cook Jr. suggested that this might be a cartographic error, the result of inaccurate measurements or the imagination of cartographers filling empty spaces with mythical lands. This has happened in the history of cartography. Think of Terra Australis Incognita, the legendary southern continent that was sought for centuries. But there is an interesting detail. On these internal maps, the mysterious landmass was not just outlined, it was marked with cities, ports, trade routes. Names were written in a language that linguists could not clearly identify. Some believe it to be distorted Malay, others see elements of Polynesian languages, and others find it difficult to classify at all. And this is where the questions begin. Why would the East India Company, one of the most pragmatic and commercially driven organizations in history, include a fictional continent with fictional cities and ports in its internal navigation maps? It makes no economic sense. Inaccurate maps mean lost ships, failed expeditions, and financial losses. One hypothesis put forward by some researchers is that these maps reflected real geographical understandings of the time, based on the accounts of sailors and traders. Perhaps in the 17th century, there were islands or archipelagos in this region that traders knew about, but which for some reason did not make it into the official history of geographical discoveries. Another hypothesis is that this could have been deliberate misinformation, a way to protect trade routes from competitors by including false data in the maps. A third viewpoint is that it is indeed a cartographic fantasy, and these maps hold no special significance. But then a follow-up question arises. Why, after 1715, do these depictions almost completely disappear, even from internal archives? Let's trace the chronology. The 1680s, maps with the mysterious landmass appear in the archives of the Dutch and partially English East India Companies. About 24 such maps have survived to our time.
the 1690s, similar maps are still being created, but they become fewer. Versions appear where the landmass is smaller or more fragmented, looking more like a group of large islands rather than a single continent. The 10-teens, the number of such maps drops sharply. After 1715, they virtually disappear. In the cartographic products of European countries, the Pacific Ocean is depicted in the form we are more or less used to. What happened during this period?
It is worth looking at the broader historical context. The beginning of the 18th century was a time of significant change in European cartography. Surveying methods were becoming more accurate, mathematical cartography was developing, new navigation instruments appeared. It is logical to assume that as measurement methods improved, outdated and inaccurate data were removed from the maps. This is a natural process in the development of science. However, some researchers point to another detail. It was precisely during this period, between 1710 and 1720, that several major European powers signed a series of agreements to divide spheres of influence in the Pacific. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 and the treaties that followed redrew the map of colonial claims. Could this have influenced cartographic standards? Perhaps. History knows cases where political decisions influenced how the world was depicted on maps. But let's return to our Italian archivist and the sealed safe. According to a few accounts, local press publications and one short local TV report before access was closed, Venturelli discovered a collection of 23 maps. All were dated between 1678 and 1692. All showed a similar mysterious landmass in the central Pacific. A unique feature of these maps was the presence of Latin inscriptions, which, according to Venturelli, in that same TV report, the recording of which is now hard to find, contained references to trade contacts with this region. After access to the archive was closed, the official position of the institution was released. The maps are examples of 17th century cartographic misconceptions and are of interest only as an illustration of the development of cartographic science. They have no special historical significance. This is a reasonable explanation. Indeed, the history of cartography is full of examples of non-existent lands that appeared and disappeared as knowledge of the world improved. And yet, the question remains, why was the safe sealed? By whom and when? And if these maps are just examples of outdated mistakes, why was access to them so restricted? But before talking about conspiracies and secrets, let's ask a simpler question. Could a major civilization have existed in the Central Pacific that we simply don't know about? What do archaeology, linguistics, and DNA have to say about this? Imagine you need to find traces of a civilization that, if it existed, disappeared more than 300 years ago. Where do you start? Archaeologists in such situations look for three types of evidence: material remains, ruins, artifacts; cultural traces, language, traditions, myths; and biological markers, genetic data, remains.
Let's examine what exists in each of these categories regarding our topic. Let's start with archaeology. In the Central and Eastern Pacific, there are many islands and archipelagos. Some are inhabited, others are not. On many of them, archaeological sites have been discovered whose age raises questions. Take the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia. Here lies Nan Madol, a complex of artificial islets built from basalt blocks. The complex covers about 75 hectares. The weight of some blocks reaches 50 tons. The official dating states that the complex was built between the 12th and 15th centuries by the local Sautelur dynasty. This is the established scientific position based on radiocarbon dating and archaeological research. But there are nuances. Local legends claim that Nan Madol existed much earlier. Some versions speak of millennia. The legends also mention that the complex was built not by locals, but by newcomers from another island or continent. How reliable are such legends? That is a difficult question. In oral tradition, information can be distorted, but at the same time, there are known cases where legends contain seeds of historical truth. Remember Troy, which was long considered a myth until Schliemann discovered its remains. Another interesting point, the construction technology of non-Madol is not fully understood. How did the builders move and set multi-ton blocks on artificial islands? There are hypotheses, the use of rafts, levers, inclined planes, but experimental reconstructions are not always convincing. Does this mean non-Madol was built by some advanced civilization with technologies unknown to science? Not necessarily. A lack of complete understanding of ancient technologies is a common situation in archaeology. We don't fully understand how the Egyptian pyramids were built, but that doesn't mean they were built by aliens or Atlanteans. However, questions remain. Now let's consider the cultural evidence. Across Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, there are legends of a sunken land. Different peoples have different details in these legends, but the common theme repeats. Once, there was a large island or group of islands where a powerful people lived. Then, a catastrophe occurred, usually described as the wrath of the gods, an earthquake or a giant wave, and the land went underwater. In Hawaii, such a land is called Kahopu o Kane, the solar plexus of Kane. Kane is the supreme god. In Tahi, legends speak of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland of the Polynesians. In Micronesia, there are stories of Kaniha, a sunken continent.
How should we view these legends? On one hand, myths about floods and sunken lands are universal. They are found in cultures all over the world. This could reflect real natural disasters, floods, tsunamis, sea level rise after the Ice Age, or it could be part of the archetypal mythological structure of the human consciousness. On the other hand, some details in Polynesian legends are specific. They describe not just a sunken land, but specifically a center of civilization, the place where the ancestors came from. They point to a specific direction, usually west or northwest of their current location. And here we come to the most intriguing part: genetics. DNA studies of Polynesian peoples show a curious picture. The genetic makeup of Polynesians indicates an Asian origin. This is the generally accepted scientific position. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome shows links to the peoples of Southeast Asia and Taiwan. This confirms the Taiwan Express theory, the hypothesis that the ancestors of the Polynesians migrated from Taiwan through Southeast Asia, then through Melanesia, and eventually settled the islands of Polynesia roughly 3,000 to 1,000 years ago. But there are genetic markers that don't quite fit this picture. In 2020, a group of geneticists published a study in which they found rare haplogroups in some Polynesian populations that are not found in Asia or Melanesia. The frequency of these haplogroups is very low, about 2 to 3%, but their presence requires an explanation. One hypothesis: these markers could be the remains of an older population that lived in the region before the arrival of the ancestors of modern Polynesians. Perhaps this population was assimilated. Another hypothesis: this is the result of more complex migration patterns than previously thought. Perhaps there were additional waves of migration from unknown sources. A third viewpoint: the sample size was insufficient, and these markers are a statistical error or the result of later contacts. Which hypothesis is correct? Scientific consensus has not yet been reached. More research is needed. But let's now connect the three types of evidence. We have archaeological sites whose origin and construction technology are not fully understood, cultural legends about a sunken homeland, and genetic data containing elements that require further explanation. Is this enough to claim that an advanced civilization existed in the Central Pacific in the 17th century or earlier? No. From a scientific point of view, this data is insufficient for such conclusions. Each of these elements has alternative explanations that do not require the sunken continent hypothesis. But is it enough to ask a question and continue the investigation? Perhaps. And here we return to our maps.
If we assume, purely hypothetically, that 17th century cartographers had access to information about large islands or archipelagos in the central Pacific that later disappeared as a result of geological processes, changes in sea level, or other reasons, does this explain the appearance of these mysterious images on the maps? Theoretically, yes, but there is no proof for this hypothesis. However, there is another aspect of this story we haven't considered yet. What if the issue isn't whether this civilization existed, but why information about it might have been intentionally removed from historical records? Who would need this, and why? Before diving into conspiracy theories, let's look at how cartography worked in the 17th and 18th centuries and what role it played in politics and economics of that time. During the Age of Discovery, maps were not just scientific tools, they were strategic assets, commercial secrets, weapons in the competition between powers. Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, England, France, all the major maritime powers of the time had state cartographic services whose work was often conducted in secrecy. Accurate maps of trade routes, port locations, and navigational hazards could be worth a fortune. There are documented cases of cartographic espionage. There are cases where powers deliberately published inaccurate maps to mislead their competitors. This is a historical fact, not a conspiracy theory. Now, let's look at the specific situation with the Pacific maps. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a complex diplomatic game unfolded between European powers regarding colonial possessions. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, redrew the map of influence in Europe and the colonies. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 fixed a new balance of power.
At the same time, competition for trade in Asia and the Pacific intensified. The Dutch East India Company dominated Southeast Asia. The English East India Company strengthened its position in India. Both companies sought to control sea lanes and trade routes. In this context, the question arises, could cartographic data have been a subject of political agreements? Theoretically, yes. If certain geographical knowledge gave a competitive advantage, powers could have agreed on what information would be published and what would not. But is there evidence that something like this happened specifically with Pacific maps? There is no direct evidence. There are indirect clues interpreted in different ways. One of the most cited documents in this context is a letter dated 1693 found in the Vatican archives in the 1950s. The letter is written in Latin and, according to some researchers, contains an instruction to seal certain cartographic materials. The problem is that the full text of the letter has never been published. There are only fragmentary quotes in the works of individual historians. The authenticity and context of the letter remain subjects of debate. Some researchers interpret this letter as evidence of the intentional concealment of geographical information for political or religious reasons. Others believe the letter might have concerned entirely different issues and has been taken out of context. Still others doubt its authenticity. Without access to the full text and independent verification, it is impossible to draw final conclusions. Another frequently mentioned source are internal documents of the Dutch East India Company. In the company's archives, which are partially preserved in the National Archives of the Netherlands, there are sections with restricted access. Why is access limited? The official explanation, some documents contain information that may be sensitive from the perspective of modern diplomatic relations or concern private commercial information covered by long-term confidentiality. This sounds reasonable, but restrictions on access to 300-year-old documents inevitably raise questions and speculations. Does organized concealment exist? Proponents of conspiracy theories point to the consistency. After a certain period, around 1715, maps showing the mysterious landmass disappear not only from public sources but also from private archives. This, in their view, indicates coordinated action.
Skeptics argue this is a natural process of replacing outdated data with more accurate information. As cartographic methods improved, erroneous depictions simply stopped being reproduced. No conspiracy is required. Who is right? It's hard to say. Both explanations are logical. Both are consistent with the available data. It is important to understand the absence of evidence of a conspiracy is not evidence of the absence of a conspiracy, but the presence of questions is also not proof of a conspiracy. This is a logical trap that is easy to fall into. Let's look at the question from another angle. Did European powers have a motive to hide information about lands in the Pacific? Consider the possible motives. Motive 1. Commercial secrecy. If a certain region was important for trade, a source of resources, a strategic port, or a transit point, powers might have sought to keep information about it secret from competitors. This was practiced. For example, the Portuguese long hid the exact coordinates of their trading posts in Africa and Asia. Motive 2. Claims of discovery. In the system of that time, the discovery of new lands gave the right to colonize them. If information about the existence of certain territories was widely known before the official discovery, it could complicate the legal justification for claims. It was easier to discover a land anew than to explain why it was already on old maps. Motive 3. Geopolitical agreements. Powers could have agreed to divide spheres of influence, and part of these agreements could include a consent not to publish certain geographical information. All these motives are hypothetically possible, but whether they were implemented in practice, in our case, is unknown. But suppose for a second that the Europeans did have reasons to hide information. Does this mean the object itself, the mysterious land in the Pacific, was real? And if so, what happened to it? Could a continent really disappear? Can land disappear? At first glance, the question sounds absurd. Continents don't sink. They're made of light continental crust that floats on the denser mantle. These are the basics of geology. But let's be precise. Continents don't disappear, but islands can. Earth's history is full of examples of islands and archipelagos that disappeared due to geological processes. Volcanic islands can collapse. Coral atolls can go underwater when sea levels rise or the ocean floor sinks. Entire sections of land can be swallowed by the ocean as a result of tectonic movements.
A classic example is the island of Krakatoa. After the catastrophic eruption of 1883, most of the island disappeared. A new island formed from volcanic material, Anak Krakatoa, but that is a different geological structure. A less known but more relevant example is the seamounts and plateaus in the Pacific Ocean. Modern oceanographic studies have discovered many seamounts, plateaus, and ridges underwater in the Central Pacific. Some of them are located at a depth of only 200 to 500 meters below sea level. What does this mean? If the sea level was lower, and we know that during the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, the sea level was about 120 meters lower than today, many of these underwater structures could have been islands. But there is a problem with the chronology. The last ice age ended about 11,700 years ago. Sea levels rose to current levels about 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. If the islands went underwater, it happened long before the 17th century. However, there is another mechanism: tectonic subsidence. The Pacific Plate is constantly moving. It forms in mid-ocean ridge zones and sinks in subduction zones. During this movement, the ocean floor can rise or fall. Volcanic islands located on the moving plate eventually sink as the plate cools and becomes denser. The speed of such sinking is usually very slow, millimeters per year. But sometimes faster changes occur, associated with earthquakes or volcanic activity. Let's look at a specific historical example. In the records of 17th century Dutch sailors, there are mentions of an island or group of islands in the Central Pacific that could not be found later. One of the most famous cases is Davis Land. In 1687, a pirate, or privateer captain depending on the point of view, named Edward Davis reported seeing a large mountainous land about 600 miles west of the Galapagos Islands. He described high mountains and a coastline that stretched for a considerable distance. This Davis Land appeared on many maps of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Several expeditions tried to find it. No one succeeded.
By the end of the 18th century, cartographers concluded that it was an observation error or deliberate misinformation. But here's an interesting detail. 1687. This is the exact period when the depiction of a large landmass in the Pacific appears on the internal maps of trading companies. A coincidence? Perhaps.
Even more intriguing, geological studies show that in the region where Davis allegedly saw land, there is the underwater Sala y Gomez Plateau. The depths over the plateau are 300 to 1,000 meters, too deep to be an island now. But could this plateau have been an island in 1687? From a geological point of view, it is extremely unlikely. Such rapid changes in land levels do not occur over centuries. They require millennia. Unless something extraordinary happens. In 1687, several significant geological events occurred. The most famous is the earthquake in Peru in October 1687. Its magnitude is estimated at 8.5 to 8.7. It caused a devastating tsunami that affected the coasts of South America and possibly spread far into the Pacific. Also, at the end of the 17th century, increased volcanic activity was observed in the Pacific Ring of Fire. Several major eruptions occurred in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Japan. Could this tectonic activity have led to changes in the Central Pacific? Theoretically, yes, but there is no direct evidence. Modern methods, bathymetric surveys, analysis of bottom sediments, dating of coral reefs, could provide answers. But large-scale studies of this region have not been conducted with a focus on finding traces of recently sunken islands. Why? Partly because from a scientific point of view, there is insufficient evidence for such research. The hypothesis of a sunken continent or large islands in the 17th century has no support in the scientific community. But there is another side, funding. Deep-sea oceanographic expeditions are extremely expensive. Resources are directed towards research with clearer scientific or practical goals. Now, back to our legends. Polynesian myths about a sunken homeland are usually interpreted as memories of rising sea levels after the Ice Age or metaphorical descriptions of migrations. But what if some of these legends preserve memories of more recent events? Oral tradition is surprisingly resilient. Studies have shown that some Australian Aboriginal legends contain information about geographical changes that occurred 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. If oral tradition can preserve information for so long, why can't it preserve memories of events that happened only 300 to 400 years ago? The problem is that separating mythological elements from potential historical memories is extremely difficult without additional confirmation. We have talked about geology, archaeology, and legends, but there is another aspect we haven't considered: technology. If a civilization in the center of the Pacific existed, what technologies must it have possessed to leave a mark on the maps of European powers? And are there signs of such technologies?
Imagine you are a 17th century cartographer. You are tasked with creating an accurate map of the Pacific. What tools do you have? An astrolabe or sextant for determining latitude by the sun or stars, a compass for direction, a chronometer, if you were working after the 1760s, for determining longitude, measuring the ship's speed with a log, keeping a detailed ship's log. The accuracy of such navigation was, at best, a few dozen miles. Often the error reached hundreds of miles, especially in determining longitude. Now, let's look at our mysterious maps. According to an analysis conducted by cartographic historian James Cook Jr., the same one who discovered the discrepancies between public and internal maps, some elements on these maps demonstrate surprising accuracy. For example, the position of several real islands, the Marquesas, part of the Tuamotus, on these maps is indicated with an accuracy that does not correspond to the general level of cartography of that time. The error is only a few miles, which is comparable to the accuracy of 19th century maps, when navigational methods had significantly improved. How is this possible? One explanation: these maps were created later than indicated, and the dating is erroneous. This is the simplest and most logical explanation. Another explanation: the cartographers used data obtained from sources with more advanced navigational methods. But where did these sources come from? A third explanation: it is a lucky coincidence, and the accuracy of individual elements is a result of luck rather than systematic knowledge. Which explanation is correct? Without further analysis, it's hard to say. But let's look at the question more broadly. What technologies would a civilization need to possess to effectively exist in the Central Pacific? First and foremost, seafaring. The distances between islands in the Central Pacific are enormous. Without advanced seafaring, creating a unified civilization or trade network is impossible. Polynesians demonstrated outstanding seafaring skills. They settled islands scattered over a vast territory using double canoes, celestial navigation, and observations of clouds, birds, and ocean currents. This is a documented fact. Could even more advanced seafarers have existed in this region? Theoretically, yes, but traces of such technologies should have remained. Ships are built from materials. Even if wooden hulls decayed, traces should remain. Shipyards, tools, metal elements, anchors, fasteners. In underwater archaeology, finds of ships thousands of years old are known. Are there such finds in the Central Pacific? There are isolated cases, but they mostly concern European or Asian ships of the 18th and 19th centuries. There is no evidence of an earlier and more advanced local shipbuilding tradition. However, the absence of finds does not necessarily mean the absence of the phenomenon. The ocean is vast. Systematic underwater archaeological research has been conducted in only a tiny fraction of its area. Another aspect of technology is astronomical navigation. On some 17th century maps, including those mysterious copies we are discussing, are navigational grids and notes that some researchers believe indicate the use of complex astronomical calculations. Specifically, a coordinate system is mentioned that supposedly does not correspond to European standards of that time, but to some alternative reference system. The problem is that detailed analyses of these elements has not been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. There are mentions in popular books and articles, but without rigorous methodology, it is impossible to verify these claims. Skeptics point out that different cartographic schools and traditions did indeed use different coordinate systems and projections, and what looks like a mysterious system may simply be a little-known variant of European or Asian cartographic practice. Consider a hypothetical scenario. An advanced seafaring and astronomical civilization existed in the Central Pacific. It traded with Asia and possibly America. Europeans came into contact with it in the 17th century. Why don't we see mass evidence of such contact? Why are there no trade goods, no cultural exchange, no mentions in the chronicles of travelers? Possible answers: 1. The contact was limited and did not receive wide publicity for commercial or political reasons. 2. The civilization disappeared shortly after contact, catastrophe, epidemic, war, and evidence did not have time to accumulate. 3. Evidence exists but is misinterpreted or stored in inaccessible archives. 4. This civilization did not exist, and the whole story is the result of misunderstandings, errors, and subsequent speculation. Which answer is correct? We don't know.
Technologies are one thing, but there is a more direct question. If European powers really hid something, did they leave any traces of this concealment? Is there documentary evidence of the intentional destruction of information? To begin with, there are indeed documented cases in history of the intentional destruction or concealment of information for political, religious, or other reasons. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the destruction of Aztec codices by Spanish conquistadors, the burning of books during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. History is full of examples of how knowledge was lost through human action. But were similar actions related to geographical information? Yes, they were. One well-documented example is the secrecy policy of the Portuguese crown in the 15th and 16th centuries. Portugal strictly guarded information about its geographical discoveries and trade routes. There was even a special decree, Politica do Sigilo, which ordered cartographic data to be kept secret. Cartographers who disclosed information could be punished. Maps for internal use and for sale to foreigners differed. Important details were intentionally distorted or omitted on public maps. This policy was motivated by commercial interests. Portugal controlled the trade routes around Africa to India and did not want competitors to get this information. So, precedents for the intentional concealment of geographical information exist.
The question is, was such a practice extended to the Pacific Ocean in the 17th and 18th centuries? There is no direct proof, but there are indirect indicators that are interpreted in different ways. The first indicator, limited access to archives. As we have already mentioned, the archives of several European powers contain sections with limited access concerning colonial history of the 17th and 18th centuries. Official reasons are the preservation of materials, incomplete cataloging, and diplomatic sensitivity. Critics point out, why are 300-year-old documents still considered diplomatically sensitive? Most of the participants in those events have long since died, and their states have changed or disappeared. What is the point of maintaining secrecy? Defenders of limited access policies explain it's not about the historical events themselves, but the modern context. For example, documents may concern territorial disputes that are still relevant today, or contain information about private commercial agreements whose legal status is not entirely clear. Both positions have logic.
The second indicator is the disappearance of documents. In archival work, there is the concept of lacunae, gaps in documentation. They arise for various reasons: fires, wars, negligence, or intentional destruction. In the archives of the Dutch and English East India Companies, researchers note unusually large lacunae in documentation concerning certain regions of the Pacific in the period of 1680 to 1720. One explanation, the documents were lost due to accidental events. Given the age and storage conditions, this is quite likely. Another explanation, the documents were intentionally removed. But by whom, when, and why is unclear. How do you distinguish accidental loss from intentional destruction? This is one of the most difficult tasks in archival science. In some cases, there are indirect signs, for example, the systematic absence of all documents of a certain type for a certain period, while other materials are preserved. But this is not 100% proof. The third indicator, contradictions in sources. Researchers note discrepancies between different types of documents from that period. For example, the ship logs of individual expeditions mention contacts with islanders or sightings of lands that are not reflected in official reports and maps. These contradictions can be explained in different ways: errors in ship logs, inaccurate navigation, observation errors, editorial revision when preparing official reports for brevity, clarity, or political reasons, or intentional concealment of information. Without additional context, it is impossible to determine which explanation is correct for each specific case. Now, back to the previously mentioned 1693 letter from the Vatican archives. There are several versions of what it contains. One version, based on quotes in the work of French historian Jean Delorme, 1978, the letter contains an instruction not to publish certain maps to avoid confusion among the faithful and not to hinder the divine plan of discovery. How should we interpret this? Some see this as proof of a church conspiracy. The Vatican hid geographical information that could undermine religious dogmas or disrupt the established order of colonization. Others point out the phrase "not to hinder the divine plan of discovery" could simply mean support for the official policy of European powers to colonize and Christianize new lands. The church supported colonial powers, and this is consistent with such support. Others doubt the authenticity or accuracy of the quote, as the full text of the letter has never been published. There is another document sometimes mentioned in this context, the minutes of a meeting of the Council of the Dutch East India Company from 1711. According to some sources, again, the full text is not published, this meeting discussed the issue of cartographic unification, bringing all the company's maps to unified standards. As part of this unification, it was decided to remove controversial or unverified elements. Proponents of the concealment theory see this as a euphemism for removing information about territories that really existed but were politically inconvenient. Skeptics believe this was a standard procedure for updating cartographic materials. As knowledge improved, outdated and erroneous data were removed. Nothing unusual. Who was right?
The problem is that without access to the full texts of the documents and the possibility of independent analysis, we're forced to rely on interpretations of individual researchers, each of whom may have their own biases. This is a fundamental problem of historical research. Primary sources are not always available, and we work with interpretations that can layer on top of each other, distorting the original information. We have discussed technologies, documents, and possible motives, but the main question remains. If all this is true, if a civilization really existed and information about it was hidden, what else might be hiding in archives around the world? What other stories have been erased from the official version? Before we move to the final part, let's take a step back and look at the whole picture. We have 17th century maps depicting a landmass that is not on modern maps, archaeological sites with unclear origins, legends about a sunken homeland, genetic data requiring further explanation, geological evidence of possible tectonic activity, restricted access to archives, lacunae in historical documentation. What of this is proven? Essentially, only the first point, maps with unusual images, do exist. Everything else either requires further research or allows for multiple interpretations.
But let's assume, purely hypothetically, that some of these interpretations are correct, that there really was a practice of hiding certain geographical or historical information. What else could have been hidden? This question opens up a whole field of speculation, and it is important to clearly distinguish between what are verifiable facts, what are reasonable hypotheses, and what are pure speculations. Let's start with verifiable facts. In archives around the world, there are closed sections, documents to which access is restricted for various reasons. This is not a secret or a conspiracy. It is an administrative practice. The Vatican's secret archives, recently renamed the Apostolic Archives, are one of the most famous examples. Some sections are open to researchers, others are not. The process of opening them is gradual. In 2020, documents from the period of Pope Pius XII, which were previously closed, were opened. Similar closed or restricted sections exist in the UK National Archives, the National Library of France, the Russian State Archive, the US Archives, and many other countries. Why is access restricted? The reasons are diverse and usually quite mundane. Protection of the private life of living persons or their descendants, diplomatic sensitivity, documents concerning modern territorial disputes or interstate relations, national security issues, commercial secrecy, legal restrictions, documents related to pending court cases, physical condition of materials, restoration required. All these reasons are legitimate, but they also create space for speculation. What if something more is hiding there? Let's look at a specific example that goes beyond our main topic but illustrates the broader issue. In 1929, Turkish Admiral Piri Reis created a map that, according to some researchers, shows the coast of Antarctica without ice cover. The Piri Reis map is a real historical artifact. Its authenticity is not disputed. The problem is in the interpretation. The map does show a coastline in the southern regions, but what exactly is depicted? The traditional interpretation, this is a distorted image of the coast of South America. In 16th century cartography, such distortions were common due to the imperfection of projection methods and a lack of accurate data.
Alternative interpretation is that this really is Antarctica, and the map is based on ancient sources created during a period when the continent was not covered in ice, that is, thousands or even millions of years ago. Which interpretation is correct? Scientific consensus supports the first. It is South America distorted by projection. Detailed comparisons with modern maps show correspondence with the South American coast. But the alternative interpretation continues to exist, fueled by the fact that some elements of the map do indeed look unusual. This example illustrates a broader problem. When dealing with old maps and incomplete data, there is always room for different interpretations, and it is impossible to completely rule out alternative versions if there is no 100% proof. Back to our main question, what else might be hiding in the archives? Here are several hypotheses put forward by various researchers. We emphasize these are exactly hypotheses, not proven facts. 1. Early transoceanic contacts.
Could regular contacts have existed between civilizations of different continents before the official age of discovery? There are individual archaeological finds, for example, cocaine in Egyptian mummies, some artifacts that are hard to explain without the transoceanic contact hypothesis, but scientific consensus does not support them, considering them either contamination or the result of analysis errors. 2. Lost technologies. Could ancient or medieval civilizations have possessed technologies that were later forgotten? Individual examples are known. Greek fire, Damascus steel, but there is no large-scale evidence of lost advanced technologies. 3. Alternative exploration routes. Could Europeans or Asians have explored regions for which no official records have survived? Theoretically, yes, especially private or commercial expeditions that didn't necessarily report to the authorities. Each of these hypotheses has a certain logic, but not enough evidence to be accepted as facts. And here we come to the fundamental question of epistemology, the theory of knowledge. How can we know what we know? How do we distinguish fact from interpretation, knowledge from belief? In historical sciences, there is a principle. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If we claim that an entire civilization existed, erased from history, we need compelling, numerous, and cross-confirmed evidence. At the moment, there is no such evidence.
But does that mean it cannot exist? Not necessarily. History is full of examples where established ideas changed in light of new data. Troy was considered a myth. The existence of Vikings in America before Columbus was denied. Many species of animals that paleontologists are now finding would have been considered fantasy a century ago. Science develops through the constant revision of its positions in light of new data. So, what do we have in the end? Mysterious maps? Yes. Questions without full answers? Yes. Restricted access to archives? Yes. Alternative interpretations of known facts? Yes. Evidence of the existence of a hidden civilization and an organized conspiracy to hide information about it? No. But the absence of evidence is not equal to evidence of absence. Perhaps future research will shed light on these questions. Perhaps new archives will open. Perhaps oceanographic expeditions will discover underwater structures that change our understanding of history. Or perhaps these mysterious maps are just cartographic fantasies and there is no secret. We don't know, and it's okay to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. We have come a long way from a sealed safe in an Italian library to global questions about how history is written and what might be hidden in closed archives. What have we learned for certain? Old maps with unusual depictions exist. Archaeological sites whose origin is not fully understood exist. Legends that may contain seeds of historical truth exist. Restrictions on access to some archival materials exist. What remains unclear? What exactly is depicted on these maps? Error, fantasy, or real geographical objects? Is something being hidden intentionally, or are these natural processes of loss and information management? Did a civilization we don't know about exist, or is it a modern myth? There is no single truth on this topic. There are many theories, hypotheses, and interpretations. The scientific community holds one position. Alternative researchers offer other versions. And between them is a vast space of questions for which there are no answers yet.
Perhaps that is precisely the value of such stories. They remind us that our knowledge of the world and its history is not absolute, that there are always questions that require further investigation, that the boundary between the known and the unknown is constantly shifting. Were the forgotten 17th century maps evidence of a real hidden empire, or are they cartographic delusions overgrown with legends? The answer depends on how you interpret the available data, and it is everyone's right to form their own opinion. If European powers of the 17th and 18th centuries really could hide information about an entire civilization in the Pacific, for commercial, political, or other reasons, what other chapters of history could have been rewritten or erased? How many official versions are based on incomplete information? And most importantly, do we have access to the full picture of the past, or do we see only the version of history that someone decided to show us? The truth is out there, but where exactly it is
is for you to decide.